Emily Davis was 21, and the world had not yet learned her name, though those who knew her often whispered about her brightness, the way she carried herself, and the subtle confidence that seemed too large for a girl so quiet at times. Denver, in the spring of 2001, had a soft kind of optimism. The city's streets gleamed under the occasional drizzle, the sun setting late, bathing buildings in gold, and for someone like Emily, it was easy to feel that life itself had been written just for her. She lived in a modest apartment with her parents, a space that smelled faintly of lavender and old books, the furniture scratched but well-loved, and windows that framed the restless city like a painting. Her parents, Susan and Robert Davis, were complicated in ways that only the intimately close could describe. They loved her, of course, but their love was often distracted, diverted into their own ambitions and frustrations. Susan spent hours at her boutique downtown, always sorting fabrics or negotiating with suppliers, while Robert, with his quiet intensity, remained lost in numbers and business calls, his presence constant, yet strangely absent. Emily learned early to navigate this space, to carve out her own corners of freedom, to speak softly but be seen, to smile even when her warnings were met with dismissive half-nods. Her boyfriend, Michael, was 23, studying to be a graphic designer. He had that easy confidence that comes naturally to people who never doubt their charm, but with Emily, he was gentle. He noticed her nuances, the fleeting hesitation in her smile, the way she flinched at sudden noises, the way her eyes lingered too long on dark corners of streets she walked alone. Their relationship was ordinary in the ways that counted. Movie nights, long talks over coffee, weekend walks, but extraordinary in its intimacy. Michael knew the subtle details of Emily's life, the small rituals she clung to, the way she always carried a notebook, the pen tucked behind her ear, even on the shortest trips out of the apartment. It was during one of those ordinary evenings that the first whisper of unease entered Emily's life. She had been returning from a late class in literature, a night course she loved, though her parents never asked about it. And the streets were unusually quiet. Rain had left a faint mist hovering over the sidewalks, reflecting the neon of a distant diner sign. And then she saw him. A man, walking at a measured pace, a shadow too deliberate to be casual. She thought perhaps it was coincidence. Denver had its drifters, people wandered, people got lost, people smoked and muttered to themselves. But as she walked, he remained behind her, always keeping the same distance, never passing her, never turning back. Emily told her parents that night, in the warm glow of the apartment kitchen. "I think someone's following me," she said quietly, cutting vegetables for dinner, trying to sound calm even as her hands trembled. Her mother, brushing a strand of hair from her face, looked up with mild irritation. "Emily, you worry too much. Maybe it's just someone on their way home. You're imagining things." Her father didn't even glance up from the paperwork scattered across the table. "Don't let your imagination run wild," he said. "You've got school, work, just focus on that." They meant no harm, really. They were absorbed in their lives, unable to see how crucial it was to her. But Emily left the kitchen that night with a seed of doubt, a tension she couldn't shake. The streets of Denver felt colder than usual when she walked back to her room. She imagined the man behind her, tracing her steps with precision. Over the next few weeks, Emily began noticing him more often. At first it was subtle. The man standing across the street as she exited the grocery store, a shadow in a window of a building she passed on her way to night class. Occasionally she'd see him waiting on a corner, cigarette smoke curling lazily in the air, as though he were waiting for something, or someone. She told Michael one evening, her voice hesitant, cautious. "I think he's following me. I've seen him a few times now, always keeping the same distance. It's unsettling." Michael frowned, concern knitting his brow. He suggested walking her home after class, insisting that he would never let her face that fear alone. "No one should make you feel unsafe, Emily. Not in Denver, not anywhere. We'll figure this out." For weeks he kept his promise. Every evening he would wait for her outside the building, and they'd walk together along dimly lit streets, passing the same alleys and corners she had once feared. And with him by her side, the man vanished like a ghost retreating from sunlight. It was a relief, but it never fully erased the unease. The fear had planted itself in her consciousness, and even in ordinary moments, her heartbeat would spike at the smallest sound, the scrape of shoes behind a corner, the creak of a door left ajar. Emily's life continued, carrying both the light of her youth and the shadow of this quiet dread. She excelled in her classes, laughed with friends, and spent time with Michael in ways that made the ordinary feel extraordinary. She kept a meticulous routine: classes, work, study sessions, the occasional weekend adventure, and nightly journaling that captured her thoughts, her fears, and her dreams. But there was always that quiet worry in the back of her mind. A lingering sense that someone was out there, watching, waiting. The city itself seemed indifferent to her struggles. Denver was vibrant, alive, yet impersonal. People passed each other on streets without acknowledgement, cars sped past, lights flickered in the dark, and the occasional siren reminded everyone that life carried danger in unseen corners. And Emily, cautious yet curious, continued to navigate it, carrying her life in a way that seemed ordinary to the casual observer, but extraordinary to those who truly knew her. It was during one of those nights, returning from a study session alone because Michael had been detained by work, that she felt the first sharp spike of true fear. She was walking along the quieter streets, passing buildings that had seen better days, the hum of neon lighting casting pale shadows on wet pavement. And there he was. Same man, same careful distance, his gaze fixed on her. A chill ran down her spine, and she began to quicken her pace. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she remembered Michael's words, remembered the time she had felt safe beside him. She paused, tried to reason it away, but the shadow lingered. And when she arrived home that night, locked the door, and peered through the blinds, she wondered. Not for the first time, not for the last, if anyone would believe her if she told them. Her parents, absorbed in their world of numbers and fabrics, did not. They smiled politely at her anxiety and returned to their distractions. Michael, however, believed her completely. His trust was unwavering, his care palpable. And in the small, quiet moments of that ordinary spring, a bond formed between them that would become the thread connecting past, present, and eventually, tragedy. And so, Emily's life unfolded, a tapestry of warmth and laughter, friendship and love, shadowed by a presence she could not name and could not fully understand. The streets of Denver, the cafes, the classrooms, the late-night corners of the city, all were familiar, yet all had begun to feel strange. The ordinary had begun to warp, bending towards something darker, something unseen, something patient. She did not yet know that her story, which seemed so simple, so safe, was poised to spiral into fear, mystery, and endurance beyond what anyone could imagine. She did not know that in the coming months her world would be ripped apart, that safety would become a memory, and that every small choice, every route she walked, every street she avoided, would be part of a larger, haunting puzzle. Emily Davis lived on the edge of ordinary and extraordinary, of comfort and danger. And though she did not yet know it, the city of Denver held secrets she would soon confront. Secrets that would demand courage, resilience, and a will to survive beyond anything she had ever imagined. Emily's life, which had once seemed so ordinary, began to warp subtly, almost imperceptibly, into something heavier. The man she had seen that first evening continued to haunt her steps, appearing where he shouldn't have been, lingering in places that should have been familiar and safe. It was never sudden, never violent, just a presence that refused to be ignored, a shadow brushing against the edges of her daily life. At first, she tried to convince herself it was coincidence, the mind playing tricks. Denver had drifters, after all, people wandering aimlessly with no particular destination. She tried to rationalize the sightings. Maybe he was a delivery worker, a passerby, someone new in the city. Yet each encounter carried the same deliberate pacing, the same calculated distance, the same intensity in his gaze that suggested he was studying her, tracking her without her knowledge. She mentioned it again to Michael one evening after class. They had stopped at the small corner cafe they frequented, its dim lights casting warm reflections across the steamed windows. She sipped her tea slowly, gathering courage. I saw him again, she admitted quietly. The man, outside the library tonight, he was just there, watching. Michael frowned, leaning closer, the warmth of his presence grounding her fears. Did he follow you from campus? He asked, his voice low, measured. He always asked questions that cut through the haze of panic, questions that demanded clarity but never judgment. Emily shook her head. No. I don't think so. He's always just around. Sometimes I see him across the street, sometimes on the same block when I'm walking to class. I don't know why he's there. Michael's jaw tightened. Emily, we can't leave this alone. I'll start walking you to every class, every lecture. I don't care what it takes. You won't do this alone anymore. And he kept his promise. Almost every evening he was there, waiting for her outside her building, and they would walk together through the streets of Denver, passing the flickering neon signs of shops closing, the occasional hum of a car, the distant clatter of tires over wet pavement. At first, the man vanished. He disappeared as soon as Michael appeared, leaving only the echo of fear and the residue of tension that had been building for weeks. But safety, as Emily would learn, was fragile. One night, returning from a late literature class that she refused to skip, Emily noticed him again. Michael had been delayed, work obligations had kept him late, and she had no choice but to walk the familiar path alone. The streets were unusually quiet, mist curling along the pavement as the city exhaled the chill of approaching night. And there he was, same measured pace, same deliberate distance, his gaze fixed on her. A wave of cold washed over her chest, twisting in that familiar, unexplainable way. Her steps quickened, yet he matched her speed, never too close, never leaving, a constant, patient presence that seemed to anticipate her every move. Emily's mind raced. Panic tried to claw its way into rational thought, but she fought it down, recalling Michael's voice, his insistence that she remain calm, that she observe and take note. She darted her eyes toward the windows of buildings as she passed, noting the lights, the shadows, the parked cars. Every detail seemed significant, every anomaly magnified in the dark. When she finally arrived home, heart hammering, hands trembling, she bolted the door behind her. She pressed her forehead to the cool wood, inhaling slowly, trying to calm the tremor that had gripped her body. Her parents were in the kitchen, debating over invoices and bills. They didn't notice the flush on her cheeks, the rapidity of her breath, or the way her fingers shook as she reached for a glass of water. I saw him again, she said, almost as an afterthought, standing awkwardly in the doorway. Her mother sighed. Emily, you need to stop letting your imagination run wild. You're overthinking things. You're fine. Really? Her father didn't look up from the papers scattered across the counter. It's nothing. You're tired from school. Go to bed. No one questioned her fear. No one validated the dread that had begun to seep into her nights. Michael, however, was different. He listened. Always. And he acted. He became her shield, her constant presence in the evenings, their long walks together weaving a fragile sense of safety through the creeping shadows of the city. The stalker's appearances were never predictable, never loud or overtly threatening. It was the subtlety that unnerved Emily, the way he would linger at a corner, watching without moving, the faint rustle of footsteps that seemed to synchronize with her own, the sudden presence in a window she passed regularly. Ordinary moments became laced with tension. The quiet of the streets, the hum of distant traffic, the muted neon of corner stores, all became backdrops for a fear that was both immediate and intangible. Emily tried to maintain her routines. College, work, study sessions, evenings with Michael, these were her anchors, the things she clung to when the unease threatened to consume her. She documented her observations in her notebook, sometimes sketching the angles of streets or noting the times she had seen the man, the places he lingered. It became an exercise in control, a way to impose order on the creeping chaos. Michael, patient and steadfast, became attuned to these details as well. He began noticing patterns she had recorded, the locations she circled in her notes, the subtle shifts in the cityscape that she pointed out. Together, they developed strategies, alternate routes, varying her schedules, observing potential hiding places. It was methodical, almost clinical in its approach, and it offered Emily a sense of agency that she otherwise lacked. Despite their precautions, Emily could not shake the tension. The city had changed in her perception. Corners once familiar now carried the potential for danger. Shadows were heavier, streets longer, alleys darker. She imagined the man's eyes following her from behind blinds, from parked cars, from corners that should have been empty. The fear was constant, like an invisible weight pressing against her chest. And then, One night, the pattern shifted. Emily had a disagreement with Michael, a trivial argument about plans, about timing, something that seemed meaningless at the moment, but would have consequences she could never foresee. He could not accompany her that evening, and she walked alone, retracing familiar streets with a rising sense of dread. The air was cold, mist curling over the street lamps, the distant city noise muffled as if the world itself were holding its breath. That night, the man did not hesitate. He was there, watching, patient, deliberate, and as Emily turned a corner she had walked 1,000 times, she realized that the shadows themselves seemed to conspire against her. She quickened her pace, heart hammering, mind racing through escape plans. But the streets offered no sanctuary. The alleys provided no safety. The ordinary city she knew had transformed into a maze of subtle threats, and she had no ally beside her. When she failed to arrive home that night, panic began to ripple outward. Michael, frantic, retraced her steps, calling her, questioning bystanders, scanning streets for any sign. Her parents, distracted by their own worlds, dismissed initial concerns, assuming she had lost track of time or chosen to stay late. The first night passed with a gnawing sense of unease, but as the hours stretched into days, the reality of her disappearance began to settle in. Authorities were notified, reports filed, searches conducted. The media became involved. The story of a young woman gone missing threading through local news segments, snippets of interviews with friends and neighbors, painting a picture of the ordinary girl whose life had been disrupted by an extraordinary unseen menace. But despite the attention, the case seemed to stall. Leads were sparse, sightings few, and every small clue that emerged seemed to dissolve under scrutiny. Yet amidst the fear and uncertainty, the bond between Emily and Michael persisted in memory and in investigation. He refused to let her disappear from their lives without a fight. Every street he retraced, every alley he checked, every corner he observed became a testament to his devotion, his unwillingness to surrender to a city that had swallowed her presence. And so, the warning signs that had begun as subtle whispers became undeniable truths. The stalker had been patient, calculating, invisible in plain sight, waiting for the moment when Emily would be alone. The ordinary rhythms of her life, the campus walks, the night classes, the evening routines, had been carefully observed, mapped, and exploited. For Emily, the days before her disappearance had been filled with laughter, study, love, and subtle dread. For Michael, the same days were punctuated with vigilance, concern, and the early stirrings of a relentless determination that would carry him through months of uncertainty. And for the city of Denver, those ordinary streets, bathed in evening mist and neon glow, had begun to conceal a darkness that would take months to uncover, a mystery that would challenge the limits of love, persistence, and human endurance. The warning signs were there, in the shadows, in the quiet streets, in the moments when ordinary life felt just slightly off. And though Emily and Michael could not yet see the full scope of the danger, the threads were in place, the stories set in motion, the tension building toward a moment that would change everything. The day Emily Davis disappeared began like any other spring morning in Denver. The sun rose soft and gold, brushing the tops of apartment buildings and scattering reflections across windows that gleamed with dew. The city stirred slowly, with the familiar hum of traffic, the clatter of construction somewhere in the distance, the scent of brewing coffee drifting from nearby cafes. For Emily, it was a morning of routine, ordinary and unremarkable. Yet beneath the surface, a tension had been building that neither she nor anyone around her could yet understand. She awoke to the sound of her alarm, the soft chime echoing in the modest apartment she shared with her parents. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, catching particles of dust in the air, and for a moment the world felt tranquil. Emily stretched, letting the morning quiet envelop her, a fleeting sense of peace before the day demanded attention. Her parents were already in motion. Her mother moving quickly in the kitchen, arranging breakfast while checking an appointment book. Her father at the table reviewing documents, scribbling numbers and making phone calls. Their presence was constant but distant, a reminder that even within the safety of home, she had learned to navigate on her own. Emily moved through her morning rituals with practiced ease. She showered, dressed carefully for her classes, Wiki had prepared a small breakfast she ate alone at the kitchen counter. Her mind was occupied with ordinary thoughts, assignments to complete, notes to review, the expectation of seeing Michael later that evening. But amid the normalcy, there was that familiar undercurrent of unease, a shadow she could not name, a weight she carried quietly. She checked the clock several times, noting the minutes with an unconscious tension, as if anticipating something that had not yet come. The morning passed in its usual rhythm. She attended her daytime lectures, participated in discussions, and interacted with friends who noticed her alertness and focus, but could not perceive the subtle fear lingering behind her eyes. She laughed, she joked, she appeared as she always did, composed, warm, bright. Yet, in moments of solitude, her thoughts returned to the man who had followed her for weeks, to the glimpses of shadow in the corners of streets, to the moments when she felt a presence that should not have existed. Her afternoon was marked by routine errands, a stop at the small grocery store for supplies, a brief visit to the library to return books and collect research materials, and a final check-in at the cafe where she often studied late into the evening. Everywhere she went, the city seemed alive and indifferent, the streets bustling with people, cars honking, conversations carrying across distances. And yet, within that ordinary chaos, Emily remained aware of potential danger, her senses sharpened by the months of tension that had quietly escalated. By evening, she had completed her last class of the day, an elective she adored but had never discussed with her parents. A literature seminar that explored the subtleties of human emotion and the narratives that shape lives. It had been a challenging day, intellectually stimulating, yet emotionally taxing. She packed her notebook and pens carefully, brushing stray strands of hair from her face, and prepared to leave the building, unaware that this night would mark a pivotal turning point. Michael had been delayed by work that evening, an obligation he could not postpone. He called her to explain, his voice calm but apologetic. Emily listened, understanding but disappointed, and promised to walk home carefully. It was the first time in weeks she would traverse the streets alone, a routine she had once found comforting, but now carried a growing weight of anxiety. As she stepped out into the cool Denver night, the city seemed different, almost unfamiliar. The lamplight cast long shadows across the sidewalks, the neon signs of stores flickered intermittently, and the mist from an earlier drizzle lingered in the air, curling around street corners and clinging to the edges of buildings. Emily moved briskly, her bag slung over her shoulder, her mind alert to every sound, every movement. Footsteps echoed behind her at intervals, but she tried to ignore them, rationalizing that the city was filled with pedestrians, commuters, and wanderers. But she knew. Deep down, she knew. The shadow of the man she had feared for weeks was there. He walked at a measured distance, never too close, never revealing his intentions, but his presence was unmistakable. Emily's heartbeat quickened. She considered doubling back, seeking a more populated route, yet the streets she knew so well seemed suddenly labyrinthine, the ordinary corners and alleys twisting into something ominous. Her thoughts flickered briefly to Michael. If only he were here. If only she could feel the reassurance of his presence beside her. But he was delayed, tied to obligations, and she had no choice but to continue. She clutched her notebook tighter, feeling the texture of the leather cover against her fingers, a small comfort in the tense night. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came as she approached a familiar corner, a junction she had passed countless times. A subtle shift in the atmosphere, a faint sound behind a closed door, the sudden absence of ordinary background noise. It was as if the city itself had paused, holding its breath in anticipation. Emily hesitated, her instincts screaming that she should turn, retreat, flee. But she had learned to be composed, to manage fear, to present herself with confidence even when trembling inside. She took a deep breath and continued forward. And then, the moment that would mark the beginning of months of uncertainty, he moved. Not overtly, not with violence yet, but the precision, the timing, the understanding of her movements indicated a meticulous observation she could not comprehend. Emily felt a surge of terror, her mind racing through possible escape routes, yet the streets offered no sanctuary. The alleys were too dark, the main roads too exposed, and every step she took seemed anticipated, calculated, controlled by someone who had observed her life with intimate detail. When she failed to arrive home that night, the initial worry of her absence rippled outward. Michael called repeatedly, his concern mounting with each unanswered ring. Her parents, distracted by their own worlds, brushed off the first signs of panic, assuming she had chosen to linger somewhere, that she had simply lost track of time. But for Michael, the absence of Emily was immediate and profound. He retraced every familiar route, scanning streets, checking alleys, questioning bystanders, and following the faint traces of a path that seemed to vanish like smoke in the night. By the early hours of the following morning, the weight of reality began to settle in. Emily Davis was missing. Authorities were alerted, reports filed, searches initiated. The media picked up the story. A young college student, full of promise and potential, vanished in the city she called home. Friends and acquaintances rallied, community members speculated, and the first public threads of concern wove a tapestry of tension and dread. Yet despite the initial flurry of activity, the case stalled. Leads were scarce, sightings few and unreliable, and the streets that had swallowed Emily's footsteps returned only echoes. Investigators approached the situation methodically, interviewing friends, classmates, and neighbors. They examined her routines, her habits, and her social connections, attempting to reconstruct a timeline from the ordinary moments of her life. Yet the details that seemed insignificant to others, a slight hesitation at a corner, the choice of a less traveled route, the persistent observations she had noted in passing, went unnoticed. The pattern that had been building over weeks remained invisible to those who did not know her intimately. Meanwhile, Michael's presence did not waver. He became a fixture in the search, retracing her steps, observing details, questioning anomalies, insisting that every small trace mattered. His understanding of Emily's habits, her thoughts, her fears, and her routines became the connective tissue in a case that was otherwise fragmented. The ordinary city streets, the familiar landmarks, the rhythm of everyday life, all became part of a meticulous search, a narrative of determination and devotion that would carry him forward, even as hope seemed fragile. In the days that followed, Emily's disappearance became a haunting question. The city, indifferent yet watchful, continued its pulse of life. People moved through streets, unaware of the shadows that had silently claimed a part of the night. And for those who loved her, for Michael, for her family, and for a community that had once observed her quietly, the ordinary world had been replaced with uncertainty, fear, and a growing desperation for answers. The day had begun like any other, filled with the sunlight of promise, the mundane rhythms of study, work, and human interaction. But it ended in a tension that would stretch across 9 months, in a mystery that would confound investigators and test the limits of patience, endurance, and human resolve. The ordinary, the familiar, the comforting, all had been pierced by an invisible hand, leaving Emily Davis lost in the spaces between routine and danger, her life suspended in a city that seemed to move on without her. And so the first hours of her disappearance unfolded, quiet, unnoticed, but significant in every detail. The streets that had been familiar became the stage for a meticulous plan, the ordinary routines a backdrop for extraordinary danger. And Michael, driven by love and an unrelenting sense of responsibility, began the journey that would take him into the depths of fear, mystery, and ultimately the pursuit of truth. The morning after Emily's disappearance dawned gray and heavy, the Denver sky obscured by clouds that pressed low against the city, as if the atmosphere itself had sensed the weight of what had happened. Streets that had once felt familiar and alive now seemed muted, as if the ordinary rhythm of the city had been interrupted, replaced by an undercurrent of unease. For her parents, the initial panic had begun to seep into the edges of their consciousness. They moved through the apartment, quieter than usual. Voices hushed when Michael appeared at the door, insisting on retracing the route she had taken the previous night. Michael's concern had transformed into action. He insisted on contacting the police immediately, recounting Emily's last known movements, describing her usual routes, the timing of her classes, the streets she favored. He spoke with the precision of someone who knew the city intimately, someone who knew Emily intimately, someone who understood details that no official report could capture. The officers who received the call listened politely, their expressions professional, but beneath the surface, some skepticism lingered. It wasn't unusual, they said, for young adults to stay out late, for delays to occur, for misunderstandings to happen. But Michael persisted. He pressed every detail, every nuance, every fear Emily had shared with him over the past weeks. The first hours of investigation were methodical, almost clinical. Officers canvassed the neighborhoods she was known to frequent, checked nearby streets, and interviewed passers-by and shopkeepers. The city offered little in response. No witnesses had noticed anything unusual, no surveillance captured the faint traces of her presence, and the shadows she had been so wary of had dissolved back into the ordinary flow of life. Word began to spread. Friends and classmates were notified, and soon the search extended beyond the immediate streets. Flyers appeared on lampposts and bulletin boards. A photograph of Emily smiling, her eyes bright and hopeful, hair tucked neatly behind her ears, her name and number printed clearly for anyone with information. Community members became involved, drawn by the ordinary yet tragic narrative of a young woman who had vanished from familiar streets in a city that often seemed too vast to notice. The emotional toll began to mount. Emily's parents, previously distracted by their own concerns, found themselves confronting the reality they had avoided. The realization that their daughter might be in danger, that their dismissals of her fears had been inadequate, weighed heavily on them. Anxiety and guilt intertwined, leaving them oscillating between despair and denial. Michael, for his part, remained focused, channeling his grief and fear into action. He retraced her steps repeatedly, spoke to anyone who might have seen something, and refused to allow the search to stall. The media quickly picked up the story, amplifying both the concern and the tension. Local news segments ran images of Emily, short interviews with friends, and statements from police. The narrative painted a portrait of a young woman on the cusp of adulthood, full of promise, now swallowed by uncertainty. Community forums buzzed with speculation, advice, and rumors. Social patterns emerged. Online discussions suggested every possible outcome, from voluntary disappearance to foul play. Yet amidst the noise, Michael and the investigators focused on facts, the known locations, the last confirmed sightings, the subtle clues only someone close to Emily could provide. Days turned into weeks. The streets Emily had walked daily seemed to carry her absence in their rhythm. Michael found himself walking the same corners repeatedly, noting anomalies that had seemed trivial before. A partially open gate, a discarded wrapper near an alley, a flickering light in a building long abandoned. Each detail was scrutinized, catalogued, and considered as a potential lead. Yet the investigation yielded little. Sightings were unconfirmed, tips were vague, and the city continued its pulse, indifferent yet observant, as life moved around the void Emily had left. The police adopted a structured approach. They divided the city into sectors, canvassed door to door, interviewed shopkeepers, taxi drivers, janitors, and anyone whose path might have intersected with Emily's final movements. They analyzed phone records, retraced public transportation routes, and examined security footage from the limited cameras available at the time. Forensic teams scanned areas where her presence was most likely, looking for trace evidence, footprints, or anything that might suggest her trajectory after leaving class. Each lead was pursued with diligence, yet the trail remained frustratingly cold, and the absence of tangible evidence grew heavier with every passing day. Michael became an indispensable resource to the investigation. He knew details that only someone who had walked beside Emily could observe: the shortcuts she preferred, the small cafes she paused at, the narrow alleys she avoided, the minor construction detours she had complained about. When the investigators followed his suggestions, they often encountered subtle clues that had previously been overlooked. A faint smudge on a doorknob, footprints near an alley, an object out of place on the sidewalk. These small observations, seemingly insignificant to others, were critical in maintaining the integrity of the search. Community engagement intensified. Volunteers joined search parties, canvassing neighborhoods, parks, and abandoned buildings. They carried flashlights through the shadows, called out her name into empty streets, and placed posters in high-traffic areas. Local businesses offered support: temporary storage for flyers, donations for search efforts, and open spaces for organizing volunteers. The city's collective attention focused briefly on Emily Davis, a young woman whose absence had transformed from personal tragedy to a communal concern. As the days stretched into weeks, the psychological weight of uncertainty grew heavier. Her parents wrestled with guilt and fear, their distractions now replaced by anxiety that had become all-consuming. Michael's sleepless nights were filled with walking streets, making calls and following leads, yet the progress was minimal. The absence of closure, the inability to locate her, gnawed at his determination. Each unsuccessful search, each dead-end tip, added to the tension, reinforcing the lurking presence of an unknown force that had removed Emily from her life with careful precision. Authorities began to coordinate with neighboring jurisdictions. Reports were shared with police departments in adjacent areas, local law enforcement agencies were notified, and potential leads were tracked with increasing urgency. The possibility of abduction became central to the investigation. The initial hope that Emily had simply lost track of time, replaced by a grim recognition of potential danger. Yet despite these efforts, the city offered no immediate answers, no clarity, and no trace of the girl who had once walked its streets freely. Meanwhile, Michael's instinctive observations continued to guide the search. He began documenting patterns, revisiting locations at different times, and noting anything out of the ordinary. A misplaced object here, a faint impression there, became a framework for the continued investigation. Though police methods were thorough, Michael's intimate knowledge of Emily's habits and the city's pathways added a layer of insight that was critical to keeping hope alive. The tension was compounded by media scrutiny. Reporters sought interviews, neighbors whispered theories, and every small discovery, a tip, a sighting, a possible lead, was magnified, sometimes inaccurately, creating waves of hope and disappointment. Friends rallied together, organizing support groups and community meetings, striving to maintain momentum in the search. Yet as the days turned into weeks, the tangible traces of Emily's presence became fewer, the mystery deeper, and the fear more pervasive. Amidst the search, investigators and loved ones began to piece together a portrait of Emily's final day, the routine path she took, the subtle signs of unease, the brief interactions with strangers, and the fleeting moments of ordinary life that had preceded her disappearance. Each reconstructed step brought clarity, yet also raised more questions. How had someone so careful, so cautious been taken? Where had she gone, and how could an ordinary city allow such an absence to persist unnoticed? The initial shock began to crystallize into determination. Michael refused to allow the investigation to languish. He walked streets in the cold morning air, spoke to anyone who might have seen a shadow, revisited forgotten corners, and retraced every known step. His connection to Emily, his understanding of her habits and fears, became the compass for the search, a thread of continuity in a landscape that seemed otherwise devoid of direction. 9 months loomed on the horizon, yet even in the first weeks the uncertainty was suffocating. Every dead end, every unconfirmed sighting, and every overlooked detail was a reminder of the delicate balance between hope and despair. The ordinary streets of Denver, once familiar and comforting, had become a labyrinth of potential danger, each shadow holding the possibility of discovery or loss. And so, the story of Emily Davis during these initial days was one of quiet desperation, tireless search, and mounting tension. The city moved on, yet for those who loved her, time seemed suspended, each moment stretching into the next without resolution. The ordinary had been replaced by fear, the familiar by uncertainty, and every step taken by Michael and investigators brought them closer to understanding the presence that had so carefully hidden her from view. The search continued, relentless and exhaustive. Flyers multiplied, searches expanded, and the initial shock settled into a sustained effort to reclaim the ordinary from the extraordinary. And somewhere in the shadows of Denver, Emily Davis existed, caught in a reality that the city could not yet perceive, her life suspended between captivity and hope, while those who loved her persisted, tracing the faint outlines of her presence through a world that had suddenly grown dangerous and uncertain. For 9 months, Emily Davis existed in a world that was the mirror opposite of the one she had known. The city that once bustled around her, with its lights, sounds, and ordinary rhythms, became an abstract memory, a life suspended in the distant past. She awoke each day to the same confined space, the same uncertain routine, never knowing what would happen, when, or how. Days blurred together into nights, nights into endless stretches of monotony, punctuated by fear, pain, and the occasional flicker of hope. Her captor was careful, meticulous, and patient. He knew the balance between control and concealment, maintaining a presence that was felt but rarely overtly displayed. His approach was subtle yet suffocating, a combination of psychological manipulation and physical confinement that ensured Emily's compliance without immediate violence. He allowed her basic necessities, food, water, hygiene, enough to survive, not enough to feel free. He moved around her life like a shadow, sometimes observing, sometimes disappearing for hours, leaving her to her thoughts, her memories, and the growing anxiety that had become her constant companion. Emily spent much of her time reflecting, revisiting memories of her ordinary life, the warmth of Michael's presence, the mundane streets of Denver, the laughter of friends, the comfort of her home. These recollections became both solace and torment, reminders of a world that existed beyond her reach. She clung to small routines within captivity, arranging her limited possessions, counting the days, attempting to preserve a sense of identity amidst the erosion of normalcy. Her mind became a repository of strategies, mental exercises, and careful observations, always scanning for potential opportunities, always analyzing the smallest details that might reveal a weakness or a path to escape. Back in the city, the investigation continued, though progress was painfully slow. Authorities followed every lead, interviewed witnesses, and re-examined the details provided by Michael, yet the absence of concrete evidence left them grasping at shadows. Tips came in sporadically. Someone who thought they might have seen her in a park, a passerby who remembered a woman matching her description, an anonymous phone call claiming information. Each lead was pursued, yet none yielded results. The frustration for both investigators and loved ones was immense, the feeling that time was slipping away, taking with it any chance of immediate resolution. Michael, however, refused to succumb to despair. The months only strengthened his resolve. He retraced streets countless times, examined corners and alleys for anomalies, and remained vigilant for even the smallest clue. He spoke to shopkeepers, taxi drivers, maintenance workers, anyone whose presence might intersect with Emily's last known movements. And in the quiet moments, when hope seemed distant, he analyzed every detail Emily had ever shared about her routines, her fears, and the shadow she had noticed weeks before her disappearance. Emily's captivity was marked by a careful balance of survival and resistance. She learned to navigate the small spaces she was confined to, understanding her captor's routines, habits, and vulnerabilities. She observed his patterns, the times he left, the subtle signs of distraction, the routines that could potentially be exploited. She memorized the layout of her surroundings, the sounds of the environment, even the faint changes in airflow that hinted at doors or windows. Every moment was a calculation, a mental mapping of the terrain in which she was trapped. Isolation was both a weapon and a teacher. Emily's thoughts became sharp, attuned to the nuances of her situation. She recognized the small moments of opportunity, the inconsistencies in her captor's behavior, and the faint traces of the outside world. A distant dog barking, the muffled hum of traffic, the occasional glimpse of the sky. These fragments of normalcy sustained her, even as the months stretched endlessly. The psychological strain was immense. She oscillated between hope and despair, planning escape in her mind while confronting the harsh reality of her confinement. She replayed conversations with Michael, remembered his reassurances, and drew strength from the certainty of his determination. In her mind, he was not just a boyfriend, he was a lifeline. A compass guiding her through the darkness, a reminder that someone outside still cared, still sought, and would not give up. Michael's investigations became increasingly unconventional. He mapped her known routes in detail, created diagrams of intersections, cross-referenced tips, and examined reports for overlooked details. He began to notice patterns that had eluded the official investigation. The subtle movements of potential witnesses, the locations of abandoned buildings, the timing of deliveries, and other logistical details that might indicate where someone could hide undetected. Every observation was catalogued, analyzed, and compared, forming a network of possibilities that gradually focused his attention. Authorities, while methodical, often dismissed these insights as speculative. But Michael persisted. He trusted his intuition, grounded in intimate knowledge of Emily's habits, fears, and routines. He explored the city with relentless determination, observing every shadow, questioning every anomaly, and following instincts that sometimes led to nothing, but occasionally produced faint glimmers of potential significance. The community around Emily remained vigilant. Flyers were updated, search parties organized, and volunteers canvassed neighborhoods repeatedly. Awareness campaigns were conducted, media coverage kept the case alive, and law enforcement coordinated with neighboring jurisdictions. Yet the city itself remained vast, and the 9 months of Emily's absence seemed to stretch the limits of patience and hope. Inside captivity, Emily honed her awareness. She noted every sound, every scent, every subtle detail that might reveal a weakness or opportunity. Her mind became a strategic field, cataloging the behaviors and routines of her captor. She observed the placement of objects, the shifts in light, the sounds of movement, and even the cadence of footsteps. These observations were her silent rebellion, a way to maintain agency in a situation designed to strip her of it. Her physical condition was carefully maintained by her captor, enough to survive, enough to be able to continue living day by day. But the monotony and isolation were the true punishment. Each day required patience, observation, and endurance. She used mental exercises to preserve cognitive sharpness, recalling literature she had studied, reciting poems, and remembering conversations with Michael that had provided solace in the early days. The psychological toll on Michael was equally intense. He lived in a state of heightened awareness, scanning streets, tracking patterns, and pursuing leads. Sleep was fragmented, meals were often skipped, and moments of despair threatened to overwhelm him. Yet each clue, each faint trace of possibility, reinforced his determination. He refused to let the months erode his resolve. He refused to accept the absence of Emily as permanent without exhausting every potential avenue. As the weeks turned into months, Michael's approach became increasingly methodical. He developed detailed timelines, compared witness accounts, and cross-referenced locations that might have been used for concealment. He revisited overlooked tips, conducted independent inquiries, and occasionally discovered small details that had been dismissed by investigators. A corner where an unfamiliar vehicle had been parked, a construction site with unusual activity, or the presence of discarded items that could indicate habitation. Emily's resilience during captivity was extraordinary. She learned to regulate fear, to maintain hope, and to observe the environment with precision. She maintained routines that provided psychological stability, tracking time, cataloging small details, and mentally rehearsing potential escape strategies. Her survival instincts were heightened, sharpened by months of careful observation and the ever-present tension of her surroundings. Meanwhile, the investigation remained active but frustrated. Leads came and went, tips proved unfruitful, and the passage of time added weight to the urgency. Authorities continued searches, analyzed potential locations, and attempted to track patterns of movement. Yet the evidence remained minimal. Michael's contributions, grounded in intimate knowledge of Emily's behavior and the city, remained critical to maintaining momentum and focus. Through the 9 months, Emily's connection to Michael persisted as a lifeline. Memories of his presence, his voice, and his unwavering commitment became a source of psychological sustenance. She imagined his footsteps alongside hers, the warmth of his reassurance, the meticulous care he took in ensuring her safety, even before she disappeared. In her mind, he was an anchor, a constant amidst the chaos and fear, and the knowledge that he searched tirelessly was a critical element of her survival. The months of captivity were both harrowing and instructive. Emily adapted, observed, and preserved mental and emotional strength. Michael's relentless search, grounded in careful observation and deep understanding of her life, laid the groundwork for eventual discovery. The ordinary routines of the city, the seemingly insignificant patterns of human behavior, and the faint traces left behind in her absence would ultimately converge, guiding investigators toward the path that would finally bring Emily back. 9 months passed, each day a struggle for survival, each week a test of endurance and hope. The city of Denver continued its pulse, unaware of the invisible narrative unfolding in its midst, while those who loved Emily, particularly Michael, refused to let the story end in absence. The stage was set for revelation, for discovery, and for the convergence of persistence, observation, and chance that would ultimately bring the ordinary girl back from the extraordinary circumstances that had ensnared her. The 9th month of Emily Davis's disappearance was a turning point, though no one could have anticipated the precise moment when hope would emerge from the long, unrelenting shadow of fear. For Michael, each day had been a meticulous exercise in observation, deduction, and persistence. He had mapped streets, retraced her routes, catalogued possible hiding places, and examined every overlooked detail from the earliest hours of her disappearance. And yet, even in his exhaustive analysis, he had never imagined that the breakthrough would come not from official leads, but from his own intuition and the faint traces Emily had unknowingly left behind. It began with a simple observation, one that seemed insignificant at first glance. Michael was reviewing a collection of tips and leads that had accumulated over months, notes he had taken meticulously from conversations with witnesses, community members, and even casual pedestrians. His eyes scanned each detail with the intensity of someone who had spent 9 months living inside a puzzle, seeking the faintest thread that could unravel the mystery. And then it struck him. A small pattern in the locations described by the most credible witnesses. An anomaly in the timeline. A faint consistency that suggested movement toward a specific area that had been largely overlooked. He leaned back in his chair, the dim light of his apartment casting long shadows across the floor. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. Here was a thread, a possibility that could finally intersect with reality, a route to discovery that had lain dormant beneath the surface for months. He knew that time was critical. Every day that passed without action reduced the chance of finding Emily unharmed. Yet the lead demanded caution, a measured approach that balanced urgency with strategy. Michael revisited the city streets, walking the familiar corners and alleys with renewed focus. He retraced the path he had traveled countless times before, examining every potential hiding place, noting changes in construction, landscaping, and traffic patterns. The environment had shifted over 9 months. Fences had been erected, buildings renovated, abandoned lots cleared. But the subtle signs he sought persisted, faint imprints of human presence that could not be erased. And then he found it. A small object, partially concealed in an overgrown lot, caught his attention. It was mundane, a scrap of paper, a fragment of a wrapper, a faint footprint. Yet it resonated with significance because it aligned perfectly with the subtle patterns he had observed. He knelt, examining the site with care, recognizing the placement of the object as intentional, or at the very least, as part of the path his intuition had traced. Michael's pulse quickened. This was not coincidence. This was a clue. He documented the location meticulously, photographing the surroundings, noting landmarks, and creating a detailed map. He understood the importance of presenting this to authorities with precision. There could be no doubt, no room for misinterpretation. The days of independent searching had led to this moment, a tangible lead that could not be ignored. Michael approached the local police department, prepared for skepticism. 9 months of absence had created an atmosphere of doubt, even among the most dedicated officers. Tips had come and gone, and frustration had tempered their initial urgency. Yet Michael's presentation was different. He laid out his observations, his maps, his notes, and the subtle patterns he had discerned over months of relentless pursuit. He spoke with authority grounded in intimate knowledge. Knowledge that only someone who had shared Emily's life and understood her routines could possess. Initially, the officers were cautious, their tone polite but reserved. They had encountered countless leads that led nowhere, each one eroding confidence. But as Michael walked them through his findings, demonstrating the consistency of the pattern and the specificity of the location, a shift occurred. The faint spark of possibility ignited into focused attention. Officers conferred, reviewing previous reports, reconsidering areas that had been dismissed, and recognizing the potential significance of Michael's insight. Within hours, a search team was assembled. The area Michael had identified was cordoned off, officers moving with urgency, tempered by caution. Surveillance was established, streets were examined, and every potential entry point scrutinized. The energy among law enforcement shifted from routine procedure to the charged intensity of anticipation. Something was out there, something tangible, and Michael's intuition had led them to it. Emily, during these same hours, remained unaware that her life was on the cusp of change. Months of captivity had taught her to be vigilant, to anticipate, to observe every detail with meticulous attention. She noticed subtle shifts in her environment. The tone of her captor's voice, the sound of distant vehicles, the rhythm of footfalls beyond her confinement. She could not yet imagine the external forces converging to her location, the network of knowledge, intuition, and persistence that had been orchestrated by Michael and law enforcement. As the search team closed in, the captor sensed the shift before it became overtly dangerous. Patterns of behavior that had been effective for months suddenly became tenuous. The precision that had ensured control was now compromised, the margins for error narrowing. And within the walls of captivity, Emily remained alert, sensing the change, feeling the tension, but unable to articulate the source. Michael arrived at the scene with the search team, guiding officers through the route he had meticulously mapped. His knowledge of Emily's habits, the city's geography, and the subtle cues of human behavior was instrumental in focusing the search. Every corner, every building, every potential hiding place was examined systematically. Yet the tension persisted, the uncertainty, the fragility of hope, and the possibility that even this lead could fail. Hours passed with careful scrutiny. Officers moved in formation, checking every detail, scanning spaces that had been overlooked in prior searches. Michael pointed out minor anomalies, locations where objects were slightly displaced, and signs that indicated human presence. The methodical approach, guided by his intimate understanding, gradually narrowed the focus to a single structure. A modest, unassuming building on the outskirts of the area, largely unnoticed amidst the city's bustle. It was a place that blended into the environment, ordinary to anyone who had not observed the subtle signs. Yet Michael recognized the significance immediately. The layout matched patterns he had deduced. The environmental cues aligned with his observations, and the faint traces he had identified pointed directly to it. The search team approached with caution, aware that the situation could be volatile, yet driven by the urgency of the potential discovery. Inside, the air was tense, charged with anticipation. Officers advanced carefully, each step deliberate, their presence known but controlled to avoid alarming anyone inside. And then, in a small, confined space, Emily Davis was found. The months of isolation, fear, and endurance had culminated in this moment. A return to the world that had continued without her. A reunion made possible by relentless dedication and precise observation. The reaction was immediate and emotional. Officers assisted her out of confinement, ensuring her safety while providing medical attention. Michael, witnessing her emergence, felt a flood of emotion, relief, gratitude, love, and the overwhelming reality that his persistence had preserved her life. Emily's eyes met his, and in that silent exchange, months of fear, endurance, and determination converged into understanding. The invisible thread that had connected them throughout captivity was realized in that single, profound moment. Authorities documented the scene meticulously, gathering evidence, photographing the environment, and preserving the integrity of the discovery. Emily was examined by medical personnel, assessed for both physical and psychological well-being, and transported to a safe environment where she could begin the process of recovery. The captor was taken into custody without incident, the months of manipulation and concealment finally coming to an abrupt and irreversible end. The breakthrough was not merely a matter of luck. It was the product of relentless observation, the understanding of subtle human behavior, and the persistence of someone who refused to accept absence as final. Michael's knowledge of Emily's routines, fears, and habits had intersected with law enforcement's procedural capabilities to create a convergence that led directly to her rescue. The community's reaction was profound. News of Emily's recovery spread rapidly, bringing relief and a collective sense of awe at the perseverance demonstrated by those who loved her. Friends, family, and neighbors celebrated the reunion while acknowledging the harrowing ordeal that had defined the preceding months. The city, momentarily aware of the narrative that had unfolded in its midst, absorbed the story as both a cautionary tale and a testament to human determination. Emily, though traumatized, displayed remarkable resilience. The months of captivity had tested her physically and psychologically, Yet she emerged with a clarity and strength that spoke to her inner fortitude. Her bond with Michael, reinforced through shared memory, trust, and unwavering dedication, became central to her recovery. Together, they navigated the complex emotions of relief, anger, gratitude, and reflection, understanding that the path ahead would require patience, therapy, and the support of loved ones. For law enforcement, the breakthrough represented both closure and a reaffirmation of purpose. The case, once stagnant, had been resolved through a combination of intuition, meticulous observation, and collaboration. It underscored the importance of considering insights from those closest to victims, the value of persistence, and the potential for human determination to intersect with procedural rigor to produce life-saving outcomes. The arrest of Emily Davis's captor was both abrupt and surreal, a stark contrast to the long months of fear and uncertainty that had defined her absence. Authorities moved with precision, guided by the culmination of Michael's observations and months of painstaking investigation. The man who had held Emily in confinement, whose presence had been felt but not fully understood for 9 months, was suddenly and definitively removed from the equation. The suddenness of his arrest created a mixture of relief and disbelief. Relief that Emily was safe, disbelief at how someone had managed to exist so close, hidden in plain sight, orchestrating a nightmare that had consumed the lives of those who loved her. Emily's first moments outside the confines of captivity were filled with sensory overload. The air, the sunlight, the distant sounds of the city, each element was both familiar and alien. Months of confinement had honed her awareness, sharpened her instincts, and left her both wary and hyper-conscious of every movement. Yet amidst the tension, there was an undeniable sense of liberation, an emotional release that was overwhelming in its intensity. Michael was there, a constant presence, grounding her, offering reassurance, and allowing the fragile thread of trust to re-establish itself in the real world. For law enforcement, the arrest was procedural but meticulously documented. Officers recorded every aspect, ensuring that the evidence of captivity, manipulation, and control was preserved. The man was questioned, his movements logged, his actions analyzed for both immediate charges and long-term prosecution. He was booked formally, the reality of justice beginning to take shape as the wheels of the legal system began to turn. News of the arrest spread quickly, first through official channels, then via media coverage. The city that had once been oblivious to Emily's absence became intensely focused on the narrative, drawn by the extraordinary story of survival, perseverance, and resolution. Public response was a mixture of outrage, relief, and fascination. Outrage at the audacity of the crime, relief at Emily's safe return, and fascination with the intricacies of the investigation that had led to this point. As the initial shock faded, the focus shifted to legal proceedings. The captor faced multiple charges: abduction, unlawful confinement, and other offenses associated with prolonged captivity. Prosecutors prepared a case that relied not only on physical evidence but also on detailed testimony, pattern analysis, and the documented timeline of Emily's disappearance and subsequent recovery. Each element was scrutinized with precision, ensuring that the case would withstand the rigors of trial. Emily's testimony became central to the proceedings. She recounted the months of captivity with clarity, providing details that were both harrowing and crucial to the prosecution. Her narrative was measured, carefully structured, reflecting the trauma she had endured while maintaining coherence and focus. She described the routines imposed by her captor, the strategies she had employed to survive, and the subtle signs that had hinted at potential escape or discovery. Her words conveyed both the depth of her suffering and the resilience that had sustained her through an unimaginably difficult period. Michael's involvement was equally significant. His testimony detailed the extensive search efforts, the observations that led to the breakthrough, and the persistent dedication that had intersected with law enforcement's efforts. His account highlighted the importance of intimate knowledge, intuition, and meticulous attention to detail, demonstrating how his actions had directly contributed to Emily's recovery. The courtroom listened as he described retracing streets, cataloging anomalies, and analyzing patterns that had eluded professional investigators. His voice, steady yet charged with emotion, conveyed the relentless devotion that had defined his 9 months of searching. The trial itself was emotionally charged. The prosecution laid out the timeline of abduction, captivity, and eventual discovery with precision, supported by evidence meticulously gathered by law enforcement. Witnesses testified to minor observations, corroborating aspects of Emily's narrative and reinforcing the case against the captor. The defense, while present, struggled against the overwhelming convergence of physical evidence, testimonial clarity, and the undeniable sequence of events that had led to his arrest. Emily's parents, present in the courtroom, experienced a tumultuous array of emotions. Guilt, relief, sorrow, and anger swirled within them, reflecting the complexity of their initial responses to her warnings and the prolonged absence that had ensued. Observing their daughter's courage and the dedication of Michael and investigators, they were forced to reconcile past negligence with the present reality of survival and justice. Every moment of the trial served as a reminder of both failure and perseverance, of human frailty and the extraordinary capacity to endure and act. Media coverage continued throughout the trial, balancing the need for public information with sensitivity to Emily's privacy and recovery. News segments detailed the case, emphasizing the months-long search, the pivotal role of Michael's insights, and the emotional impact on the community. The narrative highlighted themes of resilience, determination, and the importance of vigilance in protecting loved ones, ensuring that the broader public absorbed the significance of both the crime and its resolution. The courtroom atmosphere intensified as the proceedings moved toward testimony that described the final days of captivity. Emily recounted the subtle patterns she had observed, the small moments that had revealed weaknesses in her captor's control, and the enduring hope that had guided her mental and emotional survival. The combination of her resilience and Michael's unwavering efforts created a narrative that was both compelling and undeniable, leaving a profound impact on those present. Michael's own testimony emphasized the importance of observation, memory, and intuition. He detailed the patterns he had traced over months, the small anomalies that had guided him to the breakthrough, and the eventual coordination with law enforcement that facilitated Emily's discovery. His narrative highlighted the delicate balance between personal initiative and institutional procedure, illustrating how persistence, knowledge, and careful analysis could intersect to produce life-saving outcomes. The captor, during testimony, maintained a composed demeanor, attempting to downplay actions and rationalize behavior. Yet the accumulation of evidence, physical, testimonial, and circumstantial, rendered such defenses ineffective. The contrast between the perpetrator's calm and Emily's measured recounting of trauma underscored the stark moral and psychological divide at the center of the case. As the trial progressed, the emotional intensity in the courtroom remained palpable. Each piece of evidence, each detailed account, and each recounting of events contributed to a layered understanding of the crime, its impact, and the extraordinary efforts that led to resolution. For Emily and Michael, the process was both cathartic and exhausting, an opportunity to articulate months of fear, persistence, and hope, while confronting the painful reality of what had transpired. Closing arguments framed the case as a testament to resilience, observation, and justice. The prosecution emphasized the convergence of evidence, testimony, and investigative precision, illustrating how meticulous attention to detail and human determination had ensured a positive outcome. The defense's attempts to introduce doubt were systematically countered, highlighting the clarity and consistency of the narrative presented by Emily, Michael, and law enforcement. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom held its collective breath. The captor was found guilty on all counts, a legal acknowledgement of the suffering imposed and the enduring impact of his actions. Relief, validation, and closure flooded the room, tempered by the recognition that the months of captivity had left indelible marks on Emily's life and psyche. Outside the courtroom, the emotional resonance continued. Friends, family, and community members gathered to celebrate the resolution, acknowledging the extraordinary perseverance that had brought Emily back safely. Michael and Emily, central figures in this narrative, experienced a profound mixture of relief, gratitude, and emotional exhaustion. The journey that had begun with fear, uncertainty, and relentless searching now culminated in justice, tangible, undeniable, and hard-won. therapy and support became central to recovery. Emily worked to process months of captivity, the trauma of isolation, and the psychological manipulation she had endured. Michael continued to provide unwavering support, reinforcing trust, stability, and shared commitment to healing. Their bond, strengthened through crisis, became a foundational element of both emotional recovery and the narrative of survival that defined the case. For law enforcement, the trial reinforced the critical importance of collaboration, diligence, and openness to insights from those closest to victims. The success of the operation demonstrated the potential for extraordinary outcomes when procedural rigor intersects with personal initiative, intimate knowledge, and persistent observation. The case became an instructive example within law enforcement circles, a testament to the value of integrating community engagement and detailed observation into investigative practices. The city of Denver, for its part, absorbed the narrative as both a cautionary tale and a story of hope. Awareness campaigns emphasized vigilance, community involvement, and the importance of responding seriously to warnings, no matter how subtle. Emily's story, while marked by trauma, became emblematic of survival, resilience, and the extraordinary capacity of human determination to overcome danger. The days following Emily Davis's rescue and the arrest of her captor were marked by a strange combination of relief, exhaustion, and the quiet, lingering weight of trauma. The adrenaline that had carried her through captivity and the intense moments of discovery gradually ebbed, leaving her with the raw emotional reality of what she had endured. For Emily, life no longer consisted of the predictable rhythms of daily routine or the comfort of familiar streets. Instead, it was a terrain of emotional reconstruction, trust rebuilding, and cautious reintegration into a world that had moved forward without her. Michael remained by her side, not merely as a partner, but as a constant anchor. The months of searching, the precision of observation, and the relentless determination had formed a bond beyond ordinary understanding. Together, they navigated a landscape of recovery that was as complex and delicate as any investigation. Therapy sessions became a lifeline, providing a structured space to unpack the terror, confusion, and isolation that had defined Emily's captivity. Each session demanded courage, the courage to confront memories, to articulate fear, and to acknowledge the profound impact of psychological manipulation. Family dynamics were equally affected. Emily's parents, who had initially dismissed her warnings about the man who had stalked her, faced an intricate mix of guilt, relief, and self-reflection. The months of absence had imposed a new perspective, forcing recognition of their oversight and the unintended consequences it had wrought. Through counseling and shared support, they began the slow process of rebuilding trust, opening lines of communication, and striving to create an environment of genuine attentiveness and empathy. Each conversation was tentative at first, layered with emotion. Yet gradually, patterns of support and understanding began to emerge. The captor's imprisonment and subsequent conviction provided a legal closure that was important but imperfect. Justice, measured in verdicts and sentences, could not erase the months of fear, nor could it fully repair the psychological imprints of confinement. Yet it did establish accountability, a societal acknowledgement that such actions are intolerable, and a measure of protection against future harm. For Emily, knowing that her captor would no longer have the ability to manipulate, intimidate, or control her life, provided a crucial foundation for healing. It was a safeguard that allowed her to focus on rebuilding, rather than continually anticipating danger. In the community, Emily's story became a poignant narrative of resilience, vigilance, and the extraordinary capacity for human persistence. Awareness campaigns, community discussions, and educational programs highlighted the importance of taking threats seriously, the value of attentive parenting, and the critical role that friends and loved ones can play in safeguarding individuals from harm. The city's response was not only a reflection of collective concern, but also an acknowledgement that the extraordinary events surrounding Emily's disappearance could serve as lessons to prevent similar tragedies. Michael's role in the months of searching and eventual breakthrough was celebrated quietly, often overshadowed in public narratives by the sensational aspects of captivity and rescue. Yet those closest to the investigation recognized the significance of his insights, the dedication that had guided the search, and the impact of his intimate knowledge of Emily's life. In many ways, his persistence bridged the gap between formal investigation and lived experience. A reminder that human intuition, observation, and emotional connection can be as crucial as procedural rigor in resolving complex cases. Emily's recovery was neither linear nor easy. There were days marked by emotional fragility, moments of intense anxiety, and nights filled with restless dreams that revisited the months of captivity. Yet there were also breakthroughs, instances of clarity, and moments of profound relief when the mundane aspects of daily life. Walking the streets of Denver, engaging with friends, and simply breathing without fear became sources of joy. She relearned ordinary interactions, recognizing that the simplest experiences, once taken for granted, now held deep emotional significance. Support networks played a critical role in her healing. Friends who had remained vigilant during her absence provided stability, listening to her recollections without judgment, validating her feelings, and offering practical assistance. Community support, while less intimate, reinforced a sense of collective care, providing reassurance that Emily's ordeal was recognized beyond the confines of her immediate circle. Each interaction, whether personal or communal, became a thread in the fabric of recovery, contributing to a sense of reconnection and security. The emotional bond between Emily and Michael deepened in ways that were difficult to articulate. Shared trauma had forged a connection grounded in trust, understanding, and mutual commitment. While the foundation of their relationship had been affection and companionship, it had now evolved into something more profound, a partnership tempered by crisis, resilience, and the unwavering determination to protect one another. Their conversations, once casual, now carried layers of reflection, strategy, and emotional transparency. They understood each other in ways that were inseparable from the extraordinary circumstances they had endured. Emily's parents also navigated the aftermath with complexity. Their earlier neglect, the months of anxiety, and the societal scrutiny following Emily's rescue all contributed to a layered emotional response. They engaged in therapy not only to support their daughter, but to confront their own roles in the chain of events. This process was humbling and difficult, requiring acknowledgement of mistakes, cultivation of empathy, and the development of active listening skills. Over time, these efforts fostered renewed trust and strengthened family bonds, though the shadow of past errors remained a quiet, persistent memory. In the broader societal context, the case prompted reflection on systemic issues surrounding abduction, stalking, and the response of authorities and communities to early warnings. Media outlets and academic discussions highlighted the intersection of vigilance, communication, and intervention, emphasizing the need for attentive responses when individuals report concerns about personal safety. Emily's narrative became both a cautionary tale and an example of survival, illustrating how ordinary vigilance combined with extraordinary determination could converge to save a life. Emily herself reflected on the months of captivity with a mixture of pain and clarity. She recognized that the experience had left indelible psychological marks, but also cultivated resilience, heightened awareness, and strategic thinking that were now integral to her sense of self. The trauma was not romanticized, it was acknowledged as a harsh reality, a series of experiences that had tested every aspect of her physical and mental endurance. Yet within that recognition existed an understanding of her own strength, the capacity to survive, observe, and maintain hope against overwhelming odds. The recovery process was supported by a multidisciplinary team. Psychologists, social workers, and medical professionals collaborated to provide a holistic approach to healing. Therapy sessions alternated between narrative recounting, cognitive behavioral strategies, and techniques for managing anxiety and trauma responses. Emily was encouraged to engage in controlled exposure to the external world, slowly rebuilding confidence in public spaces, re-establishing routines, and cultivating a sense of autonomy and agency. Each success, no matter how small, was a milestone, a step toward reclaiming a life interrupted by fear and confinement. Michael remained a steady presence, balancing empathy with encouragement. He participated in therapy sessions when appropriate, provided support for practical tasks, and ensured that Emily's voice and agency were always central to decisions regarding her recovery. Their shared experience created a dynamic in which partnership, trust, and mutual respect were paramount, reinforcing the narrative that survival and recovery are both individual and collective processes. The legal aftermath continued to ripple through their lives. While the captor's conviction provided formal closure, questions of long-term safety, ongoing monitoring, and potential appeals created a layer of complexity that demanded vigilance. Emily and Michael navigated these realities with care, balancing the need for security with the desire to reclaim autonomy, normalcy, and the pleasures of ordinary life. Community response also evolved. Awareness campaigns, workshops, and educational programs emphasized early intervention, the recognition of stalking behaviors, and the importance of listening to individuals' concerns about personal safety. Emily's story was shared with sensitivity, framing her experience as a lesson in vigilance, resilience, and the intersection of human connection with procedural action. Schools, local organizations, and community centers incorporated these narratives into broader safety discussions, reinforcing both awareness and empowerment. Over time, Emily began to reclaim elements of her previous life. Simple acts, walking through familiar streets, reconnecting with friends, and engaging in hobbies, became markers of progress. Each step carried layers of meaning, reflecting both the trauma endured and the resilience cultivated. Her personal narrative, once dominated by fear and uncertainty, gradually incorporated experiences of agency, empowerment, and cautious joy. Michael and Emily's bond continued to deepen, characterized by trust, transparency, and shared commitment. Their relationship, shaped by extraordinary circumstances, became a testament to the capacity of human connection to endure and strengthen in the face of adversity. Each day together was both ordinary and profound, a blend of routine and reflection, laughter and contemplation, security and cautious exploration of the world beyond captivity. Emily's parents, now fully engaged in her recovery, worked to rebuild trust, develop empathetic communication, and participate in shared experiences that reinforced family cohesion. The months of absence had altered family dynamics irreversibly, yet deliberate effort, acknowledgement of past mistakes, and consistent support created a pathway toward reconciliation and renewed relational stability. In reflecting on the case, the broader lessons became clear. Vigilance, attentive listening, and action in response to warnings are critical in safeguarding lives. Persistence, observation, and the integration of personal knowledge with professional investigation can produce extraordinary outcomes. And above all, resilience, both psychological and relational, is central to survival and recovery. The city of Denver, having absorbed the extraordinary narrative, maintained a cautious optimism. Citizens were reminded that ordinary vigilance can intersect with extraordinary determination to protect lives. Emily's story became emblematic of survival. A narrative that highlighted both human vulnerability and strength, and the enduring potential for hope amidst darkness. For Emily, the months of captivity remained a haunting but instructive memory. They had shaped her perception of the world, her understanding of trust, and her appreciation for the resilience inherent in human endurance. For Michael, the journey reinforced the power of persistence, intimate knowledge, and unwavering commitment to those we love. Together, they emerged not only as survivors but as symbols of human determination, emotional courage, and the profound impact of connectedness in the face of extraordinary adversity. Months turned into a year. Denver's skyline, once shadowed by collective grief and unanswered questions, stood brighter now, not because the city had forgotten what happened, but because it had learned from it. Emily's disappearance and rescue had transformed from tragedy to testimony, from silence and fear to awareness and resilience. Every anniversary of her return, the media would revisit the story, not with sensationalism but reverence. Articles bore titles like "The Girl Who Came Home" or "The Case That Changed Denver." Yet, away from headlines and soundbites, Emily lived quietly, deliberately, avoiding the glare of fame that survivors were often forced into. She didn't want to be a symbol. She wanted to be a person again. Healing, for Emily, wasn't linear. There were mornings she woke up drenched in sweat, the echoes of locked doors and muffled footsteps in her dreams. Nights where the silence in her apartment became too loud, where every creak made her pulse race. But there were also mornings filled with sunlight, where she brewed coffee, listened to Michael hum in the kitchen, and smiled because normalcy, though fragile, was slowly finding its way back. Michael had changed too. The months of searching, the near obsession with finding her, had left invisible marks. He'd developed a quiet alertness, not paranoia, but an instinct to scan rooms, note exits, memorize faces. He was no longer just a man who loved Emily, he was a man who had fought for her. That fight had redefined him, shaping both his identity and his purpose. After the trial, he was approached by journalists, criminologists, even true crime podcasters wanting to tell his story, the boyfriend who never gave up. But Michael refused. "It's not a story about me," he said in one rare interview. "It's about her, about what happens when people stop listening, and what can happen when someone decides not to." Those words lingered in the city's collective consciousness. Emily began volunteering with a local support group for survivors of abduction and domestic violence. She never told her full story. She didn't have to. Her presence alone, calm and grounded, was enough. Women saw in her the possibility of recovery. Men, too, came, fathers, brothers, boyfriends, who wanted to understand how to protect their loved ones better. Emily didn't preach. She listened. And when she spoke softly, but with the authority of someone who had lived through what others only studied. In the beginning, returning to public life had been almost unbearable. Supermarkets, crowded streets, laughter in cafes, they all carried hidden triggers. The sound of heavy boots on pavement, a whiff of cologne, the metallic click of a door lock, they could send her spiraling back into fear. Therapy helped, but time helped more. Michael was patient. There were days he said nothing, letting her breathe through the panic. Others, he'd distract her, drive her to the mountains, take her to a lake, or just sit in the car and let her cry until the air felt lighter. He never told her to move on. He understood that some memories don't fade. They just become less sharp, like scars under skin. Meanwhile, the Denver Police Department quietly reformed parts of their protocol. Emily's case had exposed gaps, how missing persons cases were sometimes delayed, how reports of stalking or strange behavior were dismissed until it was too late. Detectives who'd once treated it as routine now carried the weight of hindsight. One of them, Detective Carter, later said during a public forum, "We learned to listen differently after Emily Davis." That statement resonated across police departments in neighboring towns. Trainings were held, new policies introduced, including mandatory follow-ups for potential abduction risk reports. Emily's name, though she didn't seek recognition, became quietly embedded in police documentation as the Davis Reform. But legacy wasn't just about institutions. It lived in smaller moments. The parents who now listened when their daughters said they felt unsafe. The boyfriends who didn't brush off fear as overreacting. The teachers who noticed patterns of isolation in their students. Emily's story had rippled into households, changing behaviors without people even realizing it. That, she believed, was the real victory. One autumn afternoon, Emily and Michael visited the old cabin site. It had been cleared out after the investigation, the structure demolished, the area fenced, marked as private land now. Nature was reclaiming it. Grass sprouted where fear once lived, wildflowers dotted the soil. She stood there silently, watching the wind move through the trees. The forest was quiet, too quiet, but not in a haunting way, in a peaceful one. The air smelled clean. She felt the tension in her chest ease. Just a little. "This place doesn't feel like it used to," Michael said, scanning the clearing. Emily nodded. "It's strange," she murmured. "I thought coming here would hurt. But it doesn't. It's like the forest forgot to." They stood for a long time, neither speaking. Then Emily took a slow breath and whispered, "Let's go home." Home. That word carried weight now. It wasn't about walls or furniture. It was about safety, about choice. For 9 months, she hadn't been allowed to choose anything. When to eat, when to sleep, when to speak. Now, every small decision felt sacred. She started keeping a journal again. Not about the past, but the present. She wrote about things she saw, the way sunlight hit her window at 8:43 a.m., the way coffee smelled after rain, the laughter of children outside her apartment. She documented life as if relearning it from the ground up. Her therapist once told her, "Recovery isn't about forgetting, it's about integrating." Emily had resisted that idea at first. She didn't want to integrate her trauma. She wanted to bury it. But over time, She realized that her strength didn't come from pretending nothing happened. It came from surviving despite it. Sometimes she still dreamed of him, the man who had stolen her months, her freedom, her peace. In those dreams he was silent, faceless, and fading. She no longer woke up terrified, just aware. Aware that he was gone, that he could never reach her again. Michael noticed the change too. "You're sleeping better," he said one morning. She smiled, eyes still half closed. "Yeah, I guess the nightmares are getting tired of me." Emily's story found its way into classrooms, criminology courses, and awareness workshops. Without sensational details, it was used as an example of psychological resilience, the importance of early intervention, and the dangers of dismissing intuition. Professors spoke about her as Case ED, the survivor whose intuition had been right all along. In one lecture, a young woman in the audience raised her hand and asked, "Do you think she forgave him?" The professor paused. "Forgiveness," he said, "isn't always the goal. Sometimes survival itself is enough." A year later, on a quiet March morning, Emily and Michael got engaged. There was no dramatic proposal, no crowd, just the two of them on their balcony, coffee mugs in hand, watching the city wake up. Michael slipped the ring onto her finger and said, "You've already fought for everything that matters. I just want to build the rest of it with you." She didn't cry, not because she didn't feel it, but because peace doesn't always look like tears. She smiled, touched his hand, and whispered, "Then let's build." That moment wasn't an ending. It was a continuation, the start of something that didn't erase the past but carried it with grace. The man who had abducted her remained in prison. Every year, Emily received a letter notifying her of his status. She never opened them. She didn't need to. Knowing he was locked away was enough. She'd burned his name from her memory long ago. She refused to let him occupy even a word in her present. Her focus was the living, the people who stayed, the love that endured, the lessons that echoed. In interviews years later, when she finally agreed to one, Emily said something that stuck with everyone who heard it. The worst part of being trapped wasn't the fear. It was thinking nobody would ever find me, that my voice didn't matter. But someone listened, someone believed. That's what saved me. Not luck, not miracles, just someone refusing to stop listening. Michael and Emily later moved near the mountains, not far from Denver, but far enough to breathe differently. She painted now. Her artwork was abstract, vivid, reds that burned like passion, blues that hummed with melancholy, white strokes that looked like air. In one painting, a single dark figure stood in the middle of a forest of gold light. She titled it 9 Months of Winter. It was displayed once in a local gallery. Visitors stopped in front of it without knowing the story behind it. They just felt something. That was enough. When she was asked later what inspired it, she simply said, "It's about finding warmth again." As years passed, the story of Emily Davis became less about crime and more about humanity, how people break, mend, and rise again. Schools cited her resilience in psychology classes. Law enforcement used her case as a model of perseverance and intuition. Survivors found courage in her silence, in her refusal to let the worst thing that happened to her define the rest of her life. Michael once joked, "You realize you've changed half the city without even trying." She laughed. "I didn't want to change anyone. I just wanted to survive." Even now, on quiet nights, Emily would sometimes look out the window and think about that first night she disappeared, how the air had felt, how ordinary it all was. She realized that trauma doesn't always come with thunder. Sometimes it begins quietly, like a shift in wind, but survival, that too, starts quietly. One breath, one thought, one step toward the light. And in that stillness, Emily Davis, the girl who was taken, the woman who came back, finally found peace, not in forgetting, but in knowing she had faced darkness and still chosen to live. Years had passed since Emily Davis returned to the world she had been torn from. The city of Denver had changed, as cities do, but some memories never fade. They linger in subtle ways, a passing comment in a cafe, a headline in the paper, or the quiet reassurance that one's vigilance matters. For Emily, the passage of time was both a balm and a reminder. Life had returned to a semblance of normalcy, yet the echoes of fear, survival, and resilience remained etched in her consciousness. She often thought of the moments that had defined her 9 months of captivity, the subtle strategies she had used to maintain hope, the meticulous attention to her surroundings, and the small victories that had kept despair at bay. Those memories, while painful, had become part of her narrative, forming the foundation of a resilience that was no longer tentative, but unshakable. Each day she woke with an awareness of her own strength, a quiet but profound acknowledgement that she had survived against odds that could have broken most people. Michael's presence remained central to her life, a constant not because of dependency, but because of shared experience. They had endured together, not merely as a romantic bond, but as partners forged through extraordinary circumstances. The months of searching, the late nights tracing leads, the breakthroughs that had ultimately led to her freedom, all of it had built a shared understanding that transcended words. Their conversations now flowed with ease, laughter interwoven with reflection, moments of quiet contemplation balanced by joy in ordinary routines. The impact of the case extended far beyond Emily's personal journey. Within the Denver Police Department, procedural changes had been implemented, shaping how future abductions and reports of stalking were handled. Detectives spoke of the Davis case as a turning point, illustrating the critical role that intuition, attention to detail, and collaboration with those closest to victims could play in solving complex investigations. Training programs emphasized these lessons, ensuring that Emily's ordeal contributed to the protection of countless others. Community awareness had grown as well. Schools, local organizations, and advocacy groups referenced the case as a cautionary yet empowering narrative. Lessons were drawn not from fear or sensationalism, but from the importance of vigilance, listening, and proactive intervention. Emily's story became a quiet but persistent reminder that survival is often dependent on the attentiveness of those around us, and that persistence, care, and courage can intersect to create life-saving outcomes. Emily herself pursued a path of quiet advocacy. While she avoided the glare of media attention, she participated in workshops, spoke in support groups, and engaged with survivors of trauma. Her approach was grounded in empathy and experience, not spectacle. She listened more than she spoke, but when she did share her story, it was measured, poignant, and laden with the authenticity of lived experience. Young women, men, and families alike drew strength from her example, inspired not just by her survival, but by the dignity, courage, and resilience she displayed in reclaiming her life. The psychological recovery, though gradual, continued to evolve. Therapy remained a touchstone, offering strategies to manage residual anxiety, nightmares, and hypervigilance. Emily worked diligently to integrate her experiences into her sense of self, not to be defined by them, but to be strengthened by them. Each small success, a quiet walk in the city, an evening spent among friends, a day without intrusive fear, was a victory, a testament to the profound human capacity to rebuild and endure. Michael's support remained steadfast throughout. He understood that recovery was non-linear, requiring patience, compassion, and presence. He celebrated the small victories with her, provided a stabilizing influence during moments of doubt, and consistently reinforced the agency Emily had fought to reclaim. Their partnership became a model of mutual respect, emotional resilience, and shared purpose. An extraordinary connection born from ordinary love and extraordinary circumstance. The legacy of the case also extended to the captor, whose imprisonment served as a stark reminder of accountability and justice. While legal closure could not undo the trauma, it offered a form of societal recognition of wrongdoing and reinforced the principle that such actions carry consequences. Emily no longer needed to confront him, no longer had to expend energy fearing him. His absence, enforced by the law, allowed her to focus entirely on living, thriving, and reclaiming control over her narrative. Over time, Emily cultivated a sense of peace. She explored new hobbies, embraced creative expression, and fostered relationships rooted in trust and respect. Painting became one of her outlets, a way to externalize emotion, to process experiences, and to communicate without words. Her canvases were filled with both darkness and light, depicting struggle, resilience, and ultimately, hope. In her art, the months of captivity were transformed into visual narratives that conveyed depth, emotion, and insight, offering viewers a window into her journey without requiring direct exposition. Denver itself became a backdrop of quiet reflection. Streets she had once traversed in fear were now familiar and reassuring. The neighborhoods, the parks, the small corners of her life, all were imbued with the ordinary beauty of freedom reclaimed. Each step outside, each engagement with the community reinforced the truth that life could continue with meaning, purpose, and joy. Emily's parents, having grappled with their initial failings, embraced a renewed commitment to presence and attentiveness. Their relationship with Emily evolved from one marked by guilt and anxiety into a partnership defined by support, care, and conscious engagement. Family therapy had provided tools to navigate past mistakes, fostering communication, empathy, and understanding. While shadows of the past lingered, they no longer dictated the future. In the realm of law enforcement, the Davis case became part of the institutional memory. Trainings referenced it, not as a sensational story, but as a study in diligence, collaboration, and the critical importance of integrating community insight with investigative expertise. Detectives often reflected privately on the role that Michael's observations had played in locating Emily, a powerful example of how personal knowledge and intimate familiarity can intersect with formal procedure to save lives. Beyond Denver, Emily's story inspired discussions in academic and professional contexts. Psychology students examined resilience and coping mechanisms. Criminology courses analyzed investigative breakthroughs. Social work seminars explored trauma-informed care. Her experience transcended the immediate narrative of abduction and captivity, becoming a reference point for understanding human behavior, institutional responsibility, and the profound intersections between trauma, survival, and recovery. Emily's personal reflections were perhaps the most profound. She recognized that her strength did not stem from ignoring fear or denying trauma, but from enduring it, observing it, and ultimately transforming it into a foundation for life. She acknowledged the vulnerability inherent in her experiences, yet also celebrated the agency, courage, and strategic thinking that had allowed her to survive. Survival, she understood, was a combination of vigilance, hope, and relentless determination, qualities that now defined her identity. Michael often marveled at her resilience. He had witnessed her fear, her doubts, her moments of despair, and yet he also observed her ability to reclaim autonomy, to navigate the world with renewed confidence, and to build a life enriched by both love and purpose. Their shared experiences created a depth of understanding that was rare and profound, a connection that transcended ordinary narratives of romantic partnership. Emily's legacy was not limited to survival. It extended to every person who had listened, every individual who had acted on instinct, and every professional who had learned from the nuances of her case. Her experience became a touchstone for awareness, empathy, and vigilance. A reminder that individual voices, when heard and valued, can intersect with broader systems to produce extraordinary outcomes. In quiet moments, Emily reflected on the trajectory of her life. She acknowledged the darkness, the fear, and the months of captivity. Yet she also recognized the light, the people who searched, the community that supported, the partner who never gave up, and the personal strength that had guided her through every challenge. In that reflection, she found a profound equilibrium, a life informed by experience but not constrained by it, a future shaped by resilience, hope, and the unwavering pursuit of ordinary joy. Time passed. Seasons changed. Emily and Michael continued to build their life together, a life defined not by what had happened to them, but by how they responded. They traveled, created, and nurtured a shared existence marked by intentionality and awareness. The city around them moved forward, but the lessons of the Davis case remained embedded in its institutions, policies, and collective consciousness. And somewhere, quietly, the world remembered. Not just as a story of abduction and captivity, but as a testament to human resilience, the power of attentive care, and the enduring impact of persistence, hope, and love. Emily Davis, once a young woman thrust into unimaginable fear, had emerged not only as a survivor but as a symbol of what is possible when courage, collaboration, and vigilance intersect. Her life, moving forward in all its ordinary brilliance, was a living proof that even in the face of darkness, the human spirit can endure, reclaim, and flourish. And in that enduring spirit, the story finds its final resonance, not in the crime that once defined it, but in the life reclaimed, the lessons learned, and the quiet, profound power of survival.